January 1945. The western Pacific is layered with clouds, smoke, and altitude. Far below, the ocean rolls dark and indifferent, broken only by the long grey shape of a warship pushing east. Above it, Japanese aircraft descend in loose formation, engines steady, noses angled with practiced confidence. From their vantage point, the ship appears wounded. Portions of its superstructure are scarred. Several gun mounts are silent. One turret high along the deck shows no coordinated movement, no tracers rise from it, no defensive rhythm answers their approach. Inside that turret, the air is hot and metallic. The smell of burnt powder lingers from earlier engagements. The space was never designed for one man. There should be loaders shouting, a trainer calling angles, hands feeding ammunition in a continuous chain. Instead, there is only a single figure braced against the recoil mechanism, moving between controls and feed trays with mechanical urgency. Sweat runs into his eyes. The ship shudders beneath him as bombs fall elsewhere. The approaching pilots assume the same thing Japanese aviators had been trained to assume throughout the war. A turret without its full crew is a neutralized threat, a blind spot, a safe approach lane. They are about to discover how wrong that assumption is. And that moment, suspended between expectation and consequence, was shaped by everything that came before it. By the opening weeks of 1945, the Pacific War had reached a phase defined by exhaustion, attrition, and adaptation. Japan's air arm, once built around surprise and aggressive maneuver, now operated under crushing material shortages and dwindling pilot experience. Fuel was scarce. Replacement aircraft were fewer. Veteran airmen were irreplaceable. Yet the operational doctrine remained largely unchanged: overwhelm Allied defenses through coordinated attack runs, exploit damaged ships, and press home assaults even against heavy fire. For the Allies, particularly the United States Navy, survival at sea depended on layered defense, radar warning, fighter interception, and finally the hard mechanical wall of anti-aircraft fire. Warships were no longer just vessels, they were floating fortresses, bristling with guns designed to saturate the sky with steel. By 1944 and into 1945, most major U.S. surface combatants carried multiple calibers of anti-aircraft weapons, 40mm Bofors, 20 Oerlikons, and larger dual-purpose guns arranged to overlap arcs of fire and eliminate blind spots. Each gun system had been engineered with a specific assumption: it would be operated by a trained crew. A typical medium-caliber turret required multiple men working in constant coordination. One man tracked elevation, another controlled traverse. Loaders fed ammunition from ready lockers. Spotters and directors relayed targeting data. The system functioned like a living organism, each role dependent on the others. Remove enough crew, and the weapon ceased to function effectively or at all. Japanese aviators knew this. By late war, they had learned to read ships the way hunters read terrain. Silent mounts suggested casualties. Sluggish movement indicated damage. A turret that did not track smoothly was often abandoned or crippled. Pilots were trained to note these signs quickly during their attack runs, adjusting their approach to minimize exposure. A dead gun position meant a higher probability of survival during the final seconds before weapons release. But Allied ships were rarely static environments. Combat damage did not always render systems unusable. Men were reassigned. Roles collapsed inward. In emergencies, procedures were stripped down to their bare essentials. Training manuals became secondary to instinct and necessity. Naval doctrine encouraged initiative when standard operation became impossible. By January 1945, Japanese air attacks increasingly included desperate tactics. Conventional bombing runs were often followed by low-altitude strafing or steep dives intended to overwhelm gunners through speed and surprise. Some pilots flew knowing they might not return. Others still believed skill and timing could defeat even the densest anti-aircraft fire. The engagement at the center of this story occurred during one such attack. The ship involved had already been under fire earlier that day. Several gun crews had taken casualties. Some mounts were partially disabled. Others continued to function with reduced manpower. Communication across the deck was fragmented by noise, smoke, and shock. Orders, when they came, were brief and often incomplete. In one turret, high and exposed, casualties had reduced the crew to a single survivor. Standard procedure would have called for abandonment. The weapon could not be worked as designed. It could not maintain sustained fire at normal rates. From the perspective of both doctrine and probability, it was effectively out of the fight. From the perspective of the approaching Japanese pilots, it was already written off. What followed would hinge not on doctrine, but on angles, mechanics, and the untested assumption that a machine cannot be made to fight beyond its intended limits. And as the first aircraft began its descent, those assumptions were about to be tested from every possible angle. The space inside the turret was never meant to be silent. It was designed for shouted commands, for hands passing ammunition in practiced rhythm, for bodies moving in close, efficient proximity. Alone, the man inside had to replace all of that motion with memory and muscle. He shifted between controls and feed mechanisms, locking elevation, releasing traverse, dragging ammunition into position one round at a time. Every action took longer. Every delay allowed the aircraft outside to close the distance. Fatigue was no longer measured in hours but in seconds, in how long he could keep his arms steady as the mount vibrated under recoil. The turret itself imposed its own limits. The weapon could track fast, moving targets only if elevation and traverse were adjusted smoothly and continuously. Normally, this was achieved through divided labor. Alone, the gunner had to anticipate movement, preempt angles, and accept narrower firing windows. Sustained fire risked jamming. Overheating was a constant threat, yet the mechanical integrity of the mount remained intact. Bearings still turned. The firing mechanism still cycled. As long as ammunition could be fed and the trigger depressed, the weapon remained lethal within its arc. From the Japanese perspective, the engagement followed familiar patterns. Approaching at altitude, pilots scanned for active fire. They noted which mounts tracked their approach and which did not. A single turret showing delayed movement or inconsistent firing suggested crew loss or partial disablement. Doctrine encouraged exploiting these weaknesses. A damaged ship was still dangerous, but a damaged defense network created corridors of relative safety. The turret in question appeared to be one of those corridors. Leadership decisions made earlier now shaped the moment. The choice to keep the mount operational despite casualties reflected a broader Allied emphasis on redundancy and individual initiative. Officers understood that even limited fire could disrupt attack runs, forcing pilots to adjust, break formation, or release weapons early. One functioning gun could change the geometry of an attack, even if it could not stop it outright. The enemy miscalculation lay not in underestimating the weapon, but in misunderstanding the threshold at which a weapon ceased to matter. Japanese training emphasized the importance of suppressing or destroying gun crews. The assumption was logical: no crew, no gun. But it left little room for exceptions, moments when survival, training, and mechanical simplicity allowed a single operator to keep a system alive beyond its designed capacity. As the first aircraft entered range, the turret moved, slowly, deliberately, not with the smooth confidence of a full crew, but with enough precision to matter. Tracer fire asked upward, not in continuous streams, but in carefully timed bursts. Each burst forced micro-adjustments from the attacking pilot, slight changes in angle, altitude, or timing that compounded across the formation. These small disruptions accumulated, speed increased, spacing tightened. Pilots committed sooner than planned. In the compressed geometry of an attack run, seconds vanished, and in that shrinking space, the lone turret was no longer a blind spot. It was a fixed point around which the entire engagement began to bend. The first aircraft crossed the final threshold, where escape was no longer a matter of intention, but of physics. The first aircraft committed just after midday. Altitude dropped rapidly, engine pitch rising as the pilot aligned his approach. At roughly 2,000 feet, the angle sharpened. From the deck below, the attack looked like dozens before it. From inside the turret, it unfolded in fragments: sudden movement against cloud, the metallic rattle of ammunition, the slow resistance of traverse gears fighting inertia. The gun came up in short increments, not a sweep, a series of corrections. The gunner waited until the aircraft crossed into the narrow window where speed, angle, and distance converged. He fired a short burst. Tracers climbed, staggered but aligned, intersecting the aircraft's path rather than chasing it. The first burst missed. The second struck the wing root. Fuel vaporized instantly. Fire followed not as an explosion, but as a spreading brightness that peeled away from the fuselage. The aircraft rolled once, then fell out of the attack line, burning as it dropped toward the sea. The second plane entered seconds later, its pilot reacting too late to the loss of the lead aircraft. Formation discipline collapsed under surprise. This time the gunner adjusted earlier, locking elevation before the dive steepened. The mount vibrated violently as recoil stacked against recoil. A longer burst this time, tracers walked up the fuselage. The engine seized. The aircraft broke apart mid-descent, fragments scattering across the sky before vanishing into smoke below. Now the attack pattern fractured. Pilots accelerated, compressing their runs, trying to outrun the fire rather than evade it. That decision proved fatal. Speed narrowed their margins. The third aircraft approached low, attempting to slip beneath the main arcs of fire. But the turret's position gave it visibility across that approach. The gunner depressed the barrel to its limit, timing the burst as the aircraft crossed laterally. The round struck the cockpit area. The plane cartwheeled, clipping the sea at an oblique angle before disintegrating on impact. The fourth kill came not through aggression, but inevitability. A pilot hesitated. The loss of 3 aircraft in seconds forced indecision. He pulled up too late, exposing his underside. The turret tracked with mechanical stubbornness. Another controlled burst. This time the aircraft did not explode or break apart. It simply stopped flying. Control surfaces failed. The plane entered a flat spin, descending in widening circles until it struck the water, intact but lifeless. In less than 2 minutes, 4 aircraft were gone. From the ship's bridge, observers struggled to reconcile what they were seeing. Reports came in fragmented: 1 turret still firing, multiple confirmed hits, aircraft downed in quick succession. Damage control teams paused, watching the sky clear itself in front of them. Other gun mounts resumed fire with renewed intensity as the attack dissolved. Inside the turret there was no triumph, only procedure. The gunner cleared the feed, checked the barrel temperature, scanned for the next target. His hands shook now, not from fear, but from delayed exhaustion. The metal around him was scorched. Empty casings carpeted the floor. The space smelled of heat and burned cordite. Above, the sky emptied. Japanese aircraft broke off their runs, climbing away, reassessing a defense network that refused to behave as expected. What had appeared to be a wounded ship had revealed a final, concentrated resistance at exactly the wrong moment. The decisive shift had not come from overwhelming firepower or coordinated defense. It came from 1 turret that refused to die when doctrine said it should. And when the last engine noise faded into distance, the consequences of those 4 burning aircraft began to settle across both sides of the engagement. The silence that followed was deceptive. Smoke still drifted across the deck. Fires burned in compartments far from the turret. Damage control teams continued their work, sealing ruptures, treating wounded, accounting for the dead. Yet something fundamental had changed in the airspace around the ship. The expected follow-up attack never came. Radar screens showed aircraft withdrawing beyond range, their formations dispersed, their intent disrupted. Confirmation of the kills took time. Observers had seen aircraft fall, but naval procedure required verification. Lookouts recorded bearing and time. Radar operators logged disappearing contacts. Pilots from Combat Air Patrol later confirmed wreckage and oil slicks on the surface. 4 aircraft destroyed within a narrow window, all attributed to a single gun position that should not have been capable of sustained engagement. The gunner was relieved only after the ship cleared immediate danger. Medical personnel noted dehydration, muscle strain and burns from overheated metal surfaces. There were no dramatic speeches, no immediate commendations. Wartime reports were concise, factual, almost understated. A turret had remained operational despite casualties. Enemy aircraft had been destroyed. The ship had survived the attack. On the Japanese side, the losses were more than numerical. By early 1945, aircraft and trained pilots were strategic assets Japan could no longer replace easily. 4 planes lost in a single attack, without corresponding damage inflicted, represented a failure not just of execution, but of assessment. Post-mission reports reflected confusion. Gunfire had come from a position believed neutralized. Attack geometry had been misjudged. Defensive capability had been underestimated. Psychologically, the effect was disproportionate to the scale of the engagement. Japanese pilots had learned to rely on patterns, on reading a ship's wounds and predicting its remaining threats. This incident undermined that confidence. It suggested that even damaged vessels could generate lethal resistance from unexpected quarters. Every silent gun could no longer be assumed dead. Every approach lane carried hidden risk. Within Allied circles, the event reinforced existing doctrine rather than rewriting it. Training emphasized flexibility, redundancy, and the ability of individuals to assume multiple roles under fire. The turret's performance became an example cited in after-action analyses, illustrating the value of keeping weapons operational as long as mechanically possible, even with minimal manpower. Strategically, the engagement did not alter the course of the war. It did not appear in headlines or shift campaign plans, but at the tactical level it mattered deeply. A ship survived, aircrew lived, an attack failed, and on both sides, assumptions were quietly adjusted. For the gunner, the aftermath was marked not by recognition, but by return to routine. Equipment was repaired. Crew assignments were reshuffled. The turret was re-crewed when possible. The war moved on, indifferent to individual moments of extremity, yet within the official language of reports and logs, the facts remained. 4 aircraft, 1 turret, 1 operator, a result that defied expectation without defying reality, and it was that tension between what was assumed and what actually occurred that would give the moment its lasting weight. War is often described in terms of mass, divisions, fleets, production numbers, casualty totals. These measurements are necessary. They explain outcomes. They shape strategy. But they rarely capture how those outcomes are forged in moments when systems fail and individuals are left to decide whether a machine still has a purpose. The turret was designed with redundancy, not heroism, in mind. Its creators assumed crews would be available, procedures followed, limits respected. They did not plan for a single man to absorb the labor of many under continuous attack. Yet the design allowed for it, not through intention, but through resilience. Metal tolerated heat. Gears turned. The weapon functioned because it had not yet reached the point of mechanical surrender. The Japanese pilots were not reckless or incompetent. They acted on experience shaped by years of combat. Their assumptions were logical. In most cases they were correct. A damaged gun was usually a dead gun. A depleted crew usually meant silence. What they encountered instead was an exception, rare, improbable, but entirely real. And in war, exceptions are often enough. This moment did not change technology, but it clarified it. Machines extend human capability, but they do not replace human judgment. Doctrine provides structure, but it cannot predict every circumstance. When those frameworks fracture, outcomes depend on whether someone is willing and able to hold a position longer than expected, to extract function from a system beyond its intended margins. History remembers victories and defeats, but it is shaped by survival. 4 aircraft burning in the sky did not tilt the balance of the Pacific War, yet they preserved a ship, protected its crew, and denied the enemy a moment of advantage. They forced a recalibration of threat perception, however slight, at a stage of the war where such recalibrations carried real cost. The turret eventually fell silent, not because it failed, but because the battle moved elsewhere. The gunner returned to anonymity, one name among many in after-action reports and personnel rosters. What remained was the record, a brief convergence of design, circumstance, and resolve. In the end, the Japanese pilots could not believe the turret was still firing because, by every rule they knew, it should not have been. History shows that it was. And sometimes, that difference between what should happen and what does is where war quietly decides who remains afloat.